From the AntHole Narratives, this is Favors, an original dramatic short about a rising Chicago politician, a dangerous secret, and a blackmail scheme that underestimates the man it was meant to control. Listen closely. The story begins now. Favors. Darius Cole read the city the way he read legislation, once for the language, once for what the language was designed to conceal. He had been doing this for 6 years, 2 terms on the 4th Ward Council, and in 6 years, he had developed the particular fluency of a man who had come up through community organizing and housing advocacy and Northwestern law, and who knew, before any vote was called in committee, where the money was moving and who it was moving toward and what the people it was moving toward needed him to do before it arrived. Not because anyone told him these things, because he paid attention to the distance between what people said and what they needed. And in 6 years, he had closed that distance enough times that it had become a kind of professional instinct. The specific intelligence of a man who understood power as a system rather than a personality, and who had learned to read the system faster than most of the people who'd built it. Chicago machine politics was not a mystery to him. It was a system with rules, and the rules were not always written down. And Darius Cole had spent 6 years learning the unwritten ones well enough that the people who had been running the machine since before he was born were not quite sure how to categorize him. He was the most credible mayoral candidate the South Side had produced in a generation. He was also not publicly out, which was not shame. It was timing, deliberate and strategic. Part of a plan he had been building toward with the same patience he brought to everything, and which he intended to execute on his own terms in his own language at a moment of his own choosing. The padded envelope arrived before that moment. He was at his desk at City Hall reviewing committee materials for the following week when his assistant brought it in. Standard white exterior, no return address, his name in printed block letters that were not remarkable, except in the way of anything that arrived without a return address, which was that there was always a reason. The Lakeshore Corridor variance had been coming for 3 years. He knew it the way he knew everything that mattered, not because anyone told him, but because he understood which pieces were moving and in what direction and what the configuration looked like from 3 moves out. Victor Strand's consortium wanted that near North Side land rezoned, and what they were calling a mixed-use development was, at the level where the money actually lived, a displacement mechanism with good marketing and a community benefits agreement that had been revised down 3 times in 36 months. Darius had helped kill it twice. The committee vote was in 6 weeks. The committee chair had said publicly he followed Darius's lead, which was the most useful sentence the chairman had ever spoken, and which was also, Darius understood without needing to be told, the reason the padded envelope arrived at a City Hall office on a Tuesday morning in November. He opened it alone, with the door closed, the way he opened anything that arrived without a return address. The thumb drive was a standard 16-gigabyte device, no markings. He put it in his personal laptop, not the City Hall machine, and he sat at his desk and he watched what was on it. 41 seconds. Brennan's River North apartment, shot through the window of the building across the street with equipment that was not amateur. The angle was unambiguous. The content was unambiguous. The message, in the form in which it was delivered, was completely unambiguous. We have been in your life without your knowledge, and we know who you go home to, and we have been there long enough to document it. He ejected the drive. He put it in his jacket pocket. He went back to work, because the most important thing you could do when someone handed you a threat was refuse to let it change your day. The encrypted message came 3 days later, from a number that routed through enough architecture to tell him that whoever sent it had spent real money on not being found. 1 sentence. Vote yes on the corridor variance in committee. Tell no one. Or the footage goes to the Sun-Times, and then everywhere the Sun-Times goes. He read it twice. He put his phone face down on his desk. Then he called Kezia into his office and told her there was a courier log discrepancy he needed her to trace from the City Hall access records for last Tuesday morning without explaining why. He gave her 48 hours. That night, he went to Brennan's. He had not decided, in the car on the way over, how much to tell him. He had told himself he was going over for dinner, which was what they did on Tuesday nights when neither of them had evening obligations, and that he would assess the situation in person before deciding what Brennan needed to know. This was how Darius made most decisions, through proximity, through reading the actual room rather than the imagined one. Brennan opened the door in the particular manner of a man who had been home for an hour and had already poured one glass of wine, and he looked at Darius's face and said, "Come in," and stepped aside, and didn't ask anything until they were sitting at the kitchen table with the dinner Brennan had made, going slightly cold between them. "Tell me," Brennan said. So Darius told him. The drive, the footage, the message, the timeline. He laid it out plainly and watched Brennan listen the way Brennan always listened, with the full presence of someone who had learned, through years of community, land trust negotiations with people who wanted to derail him, to hear everything before he responded to anything. When Darius finished, Brennan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How long do you think we've been watched? Not what are we going to do? Not how could this happen? Specifically, how long?" Darius looked at him. "Why?" Brennan set down his fork. "About 3 weeks ago, I came home, and the window in my home office was open. I hadn't opened it. I thought I'd forgotten, or the latch had slipped. But then the week after that, a folder in my filing cabinet had been moved. I keep them in a specific order, and 2 of them were reversed. Nothing taken. Just moved." He paused. "I didn't say anything because I had no proof and I didn't want to sound paranoid. But I've been thinking about it since." Darius sat with that. "You've been thinking about it for 3 weeks," he said, "and you didn't say anything." "You've been carrying a thumb drive for 3 days," Brennan said evenly, "and you almost didn't say anything tonight." That was fair. Darius acknowledged it was fair, privately, in the way he acknowledged things he didn't want to be true, by holding them long enough to let them become true and then moving on. He reached across the table and took Brennan's hand, once, briefly, the way you touch someone when what you wanted to say was more than what you had language for right now. "Don't change anything," Darius said. "Don't do anything different. I need you to move through the next 2 weeks exactly the way you've been moving." "How are you going to move?" Brennan said. "3 moves ahead," Darius said. "The way I always move." Kezia had it in 47 hours. She came to his office Thursday morning and closed the door behind her with the specific efficiency she used when she had something to deliver that required delivering cleanly. No preamble, no qualifying, just the thing itself, in the order it needed to be received. She had pulled the service entrance logs for the previous Tuesday morning and cross-referenced them against the lobbying firm courier manifest. And what she had found was not subtle in the way of things assembled by people who expected to never have them assembled. The drive had arrived via a lobbying firm courier, a firm with a City Hall service contract that was renewed every 14 months without competitive bidding, which was one of those facts that had been unremarkable until it became remarkable. The courier was logged in at 8:47 a.m., routed to a service desk, signed for by a clerk named Davis, who had been transferred to a department in the basement 6 days after the delivery, which was the administrative equivalent of moving a file to a folder you didn't plan to open again. The lobbying firm had a contract with Alderman Raymond Pruitt's office. Pruitt had a 3-year documented relationship with the development consortium that had been trying to push the Lakeshore Corridor variance through the committee process since the previous administration. The consortium's managing partner was a man named Victor Strand. Strand was the end of the thread, which meant Strand was the beginning of the actual story. Kezia laid all of it out in 8 minutes, precise and without embellishment, and Darius listened to all of it and understood two things simultaneously: that the machine was exactly what he'd always understood it to be, operating exactly as expected, and that he was sitting across from a chief of staff who had located this trail in 47 hours, which meant she knew this particular landscape well enough to know where to look. He filed that and moved forward. "Good work," he said. "I need you on something else now. Deep background, no record of the request. The financial history on a Strand holding company called Meridian Partners from 2017 to 2019. Kezia was quiet for a half second. The half second was not long, but it was long enough. "I can have that by end of day," she said. She left his office, and Darius sat with the half second for a long time. She came back at 6:15, when the rest of the office had gone for the day, and she sat in the chair across from his desk, and she told him. Meridian Partners, 2018, a 3-month contract to provide political outreach consulting to a development initiative, work that was technically legitimate and practically a masterclass in understanding how Strand's machine operated, who it needed, what it offered, and how it ensured the people it needed stayed needed. She had been 29 and building her book, and the money had been significant, and the work had not, at the time, asked her to do anything she couldn't do with a clean conscience. "I ended the contract when it became clear what the full scope of the initiative was," she said. 3 months. I walked away from 18 months of remaining work and the referral network that came with it. And when the drive arrived, Darius said, the moment I pulled the Pruitt connection and Strand's name came up, I knew. She held his look. "I didn't tell you immediately because I needed 48 hours to make sure that nothing in the documentation I was pulling could be traced back through me in a way that would compromise what you're going to do with it. If my name attached to that trail in the wrong way, Strand's attorneys would use it to muddy the sourcing before the ink was dry." A pause. I was protecting the play, not myself. I need you to know the difference. Darius looked at his chief of staff. He had known Kezia Washington for 4 years. He understood, with the precision of a man who read people for a living, that she was telling him the truth about her reasoning, and that the truth about her reasoning was not the same as the full truth, because the full truth included the fact that protecting the play and protecting herself were not entirely separable in this instance, and that she had made a unilateral call in those 48 hours that was his call to make. He believed her, partially, which was the most honest thing available. "Going forward," he said, "everything comes to me in real time." "Yes," she said, "then let's talk about what comes next." They were being watched. Darius knew this not from evidence, but from the logic of the position. A man who had sent a blackmail message needed to know whether it was working, and the only way to know that was to watch the person who'd received it and see whether they changed direction. So Darius did not change direction. He moved through the 10 days following Kezia's briefing with the specific, exhausting discipline of a person who understood that every deviation from his established pattern was information he was handing to someone he was building a case against. He went to the same coffee place on Wabash every morning. He took his usual route to City Hall. He attended 2 neighborhood events that were already on his public calendar and said the things he would have said if none of this was happening, which required the particular performance of normalcy that was hardest when you were most aware of being observed. He kept his Tuesday evenings with Brennan, which was both normal and the thing he would have done regardless, because Brennan was not a liability he was managing. He was a person Darius was choosing, and there was a difference that mattered even when it was inconvenient, and especially when it was. The loneliness of it was specific and not something he could share in full. Kezia knew the shape of the strategy. Brennan knew his portion of the threat. His attorney, retained through a law school contact 2 days after the encrypted message, knew the legal architecture. Nobody knew the complete version except Darius, who moved through Chicago in November with a decision already made that he simply had not yet executed, which was the most disciplined kind of waiting. Not the waiting of someone uncertain, but the waiting of someone who understood that a trap only closed cleanly if you built it all the way to the end before you moved. He worked through the logic in the mornings, in the first hour before anyone arrived, and the City Hall building was quiet around him. The vote as compliance was the obvious read. What Strand wanted, what Pruitt needed to deliver, what the encrypted message had demanded. Vote yes, take the retainer of silence, let the corridor pass, and the footage went away. The vote as evidence was 3 moves out. If you voted yes under documented coercion and filed a formal ethics complaint citing that coercion in the same certification window before the vote became final, the vote itself became the proof, not just evidence of what they'd done, evidence of the specific mechanism, a sitting alderman coordinating with a private developer to improperly influence a committee vote, documented by the vote they'd coerced and the complaint filed in the hours after it. The ethics complaint needed the vote to exist. The vote was only useful as evidence if the complaint was filed while it was still wet. The timeline was the whole architecture of it, and Darius had the timeline mapped to the hour. You could not blackmail a man who had already handed the blackmail to the ethics board, and you could not dispute a yes vote when the yes vote was attached to a formal complaint that explained exactly why it had been cast. He sat with the full shape of it for a week before he moved. He wanted to be completely certain. In his experience, certainty was available to anyone willing to sit with the discomfort long enough to find it. Brennan called on a Saturday morning 10 days before the vote. "I need to tell you something," he said. "I've already done it, so this isn't a discussion." Darius set down his coffee. "I went to the federal building on Dearborn yesterday afternoon," Brennan said. "I brought my project records going back 4 years. Every instance I can document of Strand's consortium underbidding on community land, trust agreements to push affordable developers out of the pipeline. My attorney was with me. I made a voluntary statement to an assistant U.S. attorney, and I left everything we had on the table." Darius was quiet. "The patterns in my project records fill a gap in something they've been building on Strand for 2 years," Brennan continued. "I know this because the attorney I went in with has a contact in that office, and she'd done the groundwork before we walked in. They wanted what I had. They took it. I didn't tell you beforehand because you would have told me to wait, and I wasn't going to wait. Strand's people were in my apartment. I'm done being an asset in someone else's operation." Darius sat with it. He thought about 8 months of this man being exactly who he was, stubborn and principled and maddeningly unwilling to be managed, and understood that what Brennan had just done was the same thing Brennan always did, which was run toward the problem rather than around it, and that this was the quality he had been most careful not to let himself rely on, because relying on it meant trusting it, and trusting it meant something he was still deciding he was ready for. "You went to the federal building," Darius said. "I went to the federal building. With your attorney." "With my attorney." Darius let out a slow breath. That was either going to help or destroy everything. "I know," Brennan said. "I was right. You're welcome." Vote day was a Wednesday in December, the kind of Chicago December morning that made its weather the first fact of the day. Wind off the lake. Gray sky without a single concession to warmth. Darius was at his desk by 6:30, the committee materials in front of him, the room quiet in the way it was quiet before anything significant happened in it. He had called his attorney at 8. He had reviewed the ethics complaint filing, which Kezia had prepared with the precision of someone who understood exactly how these documents lived in the public record once they were filed, which was permanently, which was the point. He had confirmed with the legal team the certification window. The vote would be officially certified at 5 p.m. The complaint had to be filed before 5 p.m. to attach itself to the live vote rather than the certified record. They had until 4:45 to be safe. The committee convened at 10. Darius sat in the chamber and listened to the presentations on the corridor variants with the attention he brought to everything. Complete. Unreadable. the face of a man in a room where he was supposed to be, doing the thing he was supposed to be doing. Raymond Pruitt made a brief statement in support of the variance. The committee chair noted that Alderman Cole's position would be determinative and invited him to speak. Darius spoke for 4 minutes about housing policy on the near north side. He said the community's need for genuine, affordable units was not served by agreements that revised downward with each iteration. He said the vote he was about to cast was a recognition that the process had a mechanism for review and that he intended to let that mechanism work. Then he voted yes. In a clear voice, without visible hesitation, at 11:47 a.m. Pruitt, 2 seats down the dais, gave a small, controlled nod. The nod of a man who believed the problem was resolved. Darius observed the nod and recorded it in the specific filing system he kept for things that would be useful later, and moved on to the next item on the agenda. At 3:15, with the vote in the certification window and 1 hour and 45 minutes before it finalized, the formal ethics complaint was filed simultaneously with the Board of Ethics and the U.S. Attorney's Office. It named Raymond Pruitt and cited documented coordination between a sitting alderman and a private development consortium to improperly influence a committee vote through coercion. It attached the access log, the courier documentation, and the encrypted message in a format that preserved the metadata. And in a supplementary filing that Kezia had built with care, it attached the committee record of the vote itself, timestamp, chamber notation, the yes that was now part of the official archive. Compliance as evidence. The vote they had coerced attached to the complaint that named the coercion. The trap closed from the inside, using the only door they had left open. Darius held a press conference at 3 minutes, prepared statement. He confirmed the ethics complaint had been filed and said he looked forward to the process working as designed. He said it with the composure of a man who had been managing difficult rooms since he was 22, and he walked to the car, and Kezia drove, and he said nothing until they were 6 blocks from City Hall. "Well done," he said. "We both know it was you," Kezia said. "We both know it wasn't only me," he said. Raymond Pruitt resigned 11 days later, citing health reasons, which was the Chicago way and always had been. The Lakeshore Corridor variance was remanded to full council review, which meant it started over, which meant the community that had been fighting it for 7 years had, at minimum, more time. The federal indictment of Victor Strand came 8 weeks after the vote, on a Tuesday morning, and it had Brennan Lyle's project records all through it like a spine. Maya Torres called him personally to tell him about the indictment. She had been a year ahead of him at Northwestern Law, and they had the kind of professional friendship that lived in occasional calls and mutual respect, and the shared understanding of 2 people who had both chosen the hard version of public service and had both, so far, been glad they did. "I don't know how you knew we needed Brennan Lyle's records," she said, "but I'm glad you did." Darius thought about a man who had gone to the federal building on Dearborn with his attorney on a Saturday afternoon without asking permission, and who had been right to do it. "I didn't know," Darius said. "He knew." "Well," Maya said, "tell him we said thank you." He went through the discovery materials himself, 2 weeks after the indictment, in the quiet of his apartment on a Sunday evening. He read everything with the thoroughness he brought to everything. Once fast, once slow, looking for the thing the language was designed to conceal. He found it in the surveillance records on page 47 of the operational file. Strand's team had been meticulous, the way professional operations were meticulous when they had never expected to be discovered, documenting their activities with the thoroughness of people who believed they were building institutional memory rather than evidence. The start date of the monitoring on Brennan's River North apartment was logged at the top of the surveillance section, 11 months ago. Darius sat with the number. He had met Brennan 8 months ago. He read the page again, slowly, in case he'd misread something. He hadn't. Strand's surveillance on Brennan had begun 3 months before Darius Cole had ever walked into a community land trust forum on the South Side, and met a white bisexual developer who built affordable housing and meant it, and who had looked at Darius across a folding table with the quality of someone who was genuinely interested in what Darius was actually saying, rather than in the version of Darius that was useful to them politically. 3 months before that evening, 3 months before any Tuesday dinner or any conversation about chess or any phone call from a federal building on a Saturday morning, Brennan had been a target before Darius was ever in the picture. He had been worth watching because his community land trust work was winning, because he was stubborn and effective and had been blocking pieces of Strand's pipeline in ways that cost real money. And a man like Strand tracked the things that cost real money with the patience of someone who intended eventually to address them. Darius had arrived in Brennan's life after the surveillance was already running. Their personal connection had become, somewhere in Strand's calculus, the mechanism that made the existing threat deployable. The footage was possible because Strand's people had already been in position for 3 months. Darius closed the file. He sat in his apartment in the Sunday evening quiet with that specific weight. Not guilt, exactly, because the surveillance predated him and the threat was Strand's, and none of it was something he had put in motion, but something adjacent to guilt. The knowledge that the thing you walked into already had a history you didn't know about, and that bringing someone into your life brought them into that history too. And that even when you managed everything carefully and moved 3 steps ahead and protected the play and filed the complaint and watched the indictment come down, even then, you had not been the one who decided when the danger started. You had simply been the person who was in the room when it became usable. He thought about Brennan going to the federal building on a Saturday afternoon with his attorney and his project records and being completely right that it was the correct move. He thought about the question Brennan had asked the night Darius told him about the drive. How long do you think we've been watched? He understood now that Brennan had been asking that question because on some level, the level of a man who builds things for communities that powerful people want to displace, who has been fighting this specific fight in this specific city for a long time. He had already suspected the answer was longer than either of them knew. He picked up his phone. The press conference had run 40 minutes longer than planned, the way they always did when something significant had happened and the press wanted more than a prepared statement could hold. Kezia was driving, which she did after events like this one. Not because Darius needed a driver, but because she needed to debrief, and the car was where they did it, just the two of them. The city moving past the windows. They had been quiet for about 6 blocks when his phone buzzed on the seat beside him. Brennan, you good? Darius looked out the window at Lake Michigan, which was gray and wide and exactly as cold as it always was in November, which was completely indifferent to everything that had happened in City Hall today, and would go on being exactly what it was, long after every person involved in the Lakeshore Corridor vote had been forgotten. He typed, "Yeah, dinner tonight?" The response came back in under 10 seconds. Yeah. Kezia kept driving. The lake went on being the lake. Darius put his phone in his pocket and looked at Chicago out the window. The city he had been building towards since he was 22 years old, stubborn and clear-eyed, and 3 moves ahead. And let it be, for a moment, exactly what it was. Still standing, which was the only ending a story like this needed. You've been listening to Favors, the first release in a new series of original dramatic shorts from the AntHole Narratives. Here, you'll discover compact stories filled with drama, suspense, secrets, betrayal, and unexpected turns, alongside our full-length cinematic audio dramas, where the characters, conflicts, and worlds unfold on a larger scale. Some stories entertain us. Others leave us wondering what we would have done if the choice had been ours. If Favors stayed with you, share your thoughts in the comments, like the video, and subscribe to the AntHole Narratives for more original dramatic shorts and cinematic audio storytelling. Until the next story, keep listening, keep questioning, and never assume you know how the story will end.